Okay. Thank you so much, Dean and Turin. Thank you so much for the participant today for having this interest on the public policy as a discipline. I think it's a very exceptional opportunity for all of us to be able to delve into public policy, especially in the context of Myanmar, as you guys have been in a state of turmoil, difficult times. So public policy is one way to amend these difficulties and be able um, to systematically create feasible solutions that are able to talk about the contradictions uh, on relevant issues. How do we solve it? How do we formulate agendas? How do we technically uh, deliberate on what possible procedures can be taken onwards? So my name is Clyde Maningo. I am a PhD candidate in School of Public Policy, and I am one of the um, few ones invited to provide this lecture on the introduction to public policy. And my interest is on agenda setting, gender and sexuality studies, but I also delved on several comparative policy analysis and studies on the context of Myanmar and the Philippines. By the way, I'm from Philippines. This comparative study delved on the educational crisis, uh, specifically on the new media literacy levels and on disaster risk management financing, which I collaborated with my cohorts in my master's class way back 2022, 2023. So I am very much close to the context of Myanmar, even as a foreigner, because I read a lot of historical development, the kind of public policy style in my study specifically is in terms of the education curriculum, um, the ongoing educational crisis as well with the fake news proliferation and also on disaster risk management. You can try to look on it in the Google Scholar or anything in the web. So yeah, I'm very much honored to be able to give you this lecture today, and I hope all of us can learn from these experiences and also from these inputs that I'm gonna present to you today. Sorry. Okay, so the objective of today's lecture is first, we get to be acquainted with the basic approaches to public policy. How do public policy analysts and also scholars uh, analyzes public policy? What are the possible dimensions there is, especially for beginners? Like if you have particular niche or particular issue that you want to delve on, what particular public policy concept, theories, frameworks can you appeal into? The second one would be to identify when and how to integrate public policy concepts to particular policy issue domains and problems. So integration to public policy concepts is very, very important because we get to cite the broad paradigm there is that were nurtured by past scholars who delves specifically into particular issue of public policy. Yeah. So when we talk about public policy, I think it's relevant to delve into the definition first. How do scholars or analysts define public policy as a broad range of discipline? So the earliest conceptualization on what public policy is was envisioned by Thomas Dyke way back 1972. So he said, what the government chooses to do and not to do, only this phrase. And then later on, by the work of Laszlo and Lowy, they tried to extend this definition into stating how it affects the citizens. However, contemporary public policy analysts does not rely on this definition anymore, particularly because it tends to constrain the issue of public policy into something. For example, when we say what the government chooses to do and not to do. So you talk about only the what aspect, but in public policy, we also talk about the who. So we talk about like policy coalitions. We talk about actor analysis, network analysis, and we also talk about when. So in public policy, there's this broad paradigm of agenda setting literature or uh, um, stages cycle, who talks about particular juncture points into how public policy is created. Then we also talk about how. So there's also the dimension in public policy talking about the policy design, and there's also the where. Uh, uh, in agenda setting, there's specifically a theory on Birkeland talking about the situatedness of a policy in a broader scope of things. So we get to trace where does the particular policy fare in terms of the attentiveness of the politicians and in terms of the policy agenda becoming an actual policy. So the idea here is constraining public policy on the notion of what does not cover or elaborate all of those multifacetedness of public policy discipline in nature. And there's also the government chooses to do and not to do. By saying government, but how about those institutions or those notions outside the administrative scope of the state? So it is also a matter of public policy concerns. And by saying to do and not to do, there's also things that are saliently doing, but it's not actually tangibly doing. Then by saying how it affects the citizens, so we have to ask what is the extent of effect. There's a temporal and spatial aspect of effect. By temporal, it means the policy may be effective in the long run. We cannot see it immediately, and it is something that especially policy design takes put into account whenever they do policy. There's this long-term and short-term designing or putting into account. And citizens, so we get to ask, how about those people who are not having citizenship, for example, the immigrants, the people involved in informal sector of economy. Those people are something. Those people are struggling with the concept of citizenship. So this is something that has been debated all along by public policy scholars, but this is the simplest definition that was envisioned before. So later development of public policy was derived by a contemporary scholar, Philip Zitun. He said that it would be more beneficial if we would situate public policy rather as a political statement where policymakers would define a particular policy solution or problem definition in order to give meaning and coherence to a set of heterogeneous instruments. By heterogeneous instrument, it means variety of possible instruments, symbolic instruments, tangible instruments that can be used by state to govern citizens' behavior and to order the public by recognizing who are victims and must be supported. And who are the culprits which must be condemned. So in this way, a public policy is largely more than a set of activities. It is also the way policymakers define the state as a public authority capable of deciding and acting on society and behaviors to restore order and to solve unacceptable and solvable problems, thus building legitimacy to govern. So public policy in this context has been situated as a form of discursive statement. So it is a set of ideas that has a power dynamics, and it also appeals to the existing public policy, certain cultural and structural component that dictates the kind of legitimacy as it appears to people. So So this is one revolutionary, or how do you say, something that has been not done before, because public policy, like in this definition, has been treated as a governmental concern. But in this one, the state, it tries to move away from the state-centric definition and try to focus itself in the public policy as a political statement with discursive dimension, which could vary according to actors who defines um, the meaning of a particular policy. So in public policy, we talk about typologies as well, like what are the kind of public policy there is. So according to the work of Lowy, so he treat public policy more like a means through which the state would how do you say, enact its coercive power, but it just varies depending to the applicability of coercion or the likelihood of coercion. So when you say applicability of coercion, it, it tries to uh, so you talk about its enactability in terms of the individual, or the kind of society, socio-political um, environment where the individual operates. So when you talk about likelihood of coercion, it talks about um, whether or not it can be something felt, or felt immediately, or it could be something that is built up, and it could be more felt in the long term. So when you say individual, it tries to coerce individual conduct or control individual conduct and could be felt in the long run. So you're talking about distributive policy. When you talk about uh, coercion through means of the environment of conduct and could be felt remotely, then you're talking about constituent policy. And then likelihood of coercion and individual conduct, then it's regulative policy. Then lastly is redistributive policy, which is intersection of coercion through the environment or the social political context, and also immediate likelihood of coercion. So I tried to encapsulate the typology into a simple term in distributive. So it means allocation of resources that benefits to specific groups. So it is funded by general revenue. It has widely dispersed benefits. And for example, it's the infrastructure projects, agricultural subsidies, research and development grants. So it's just like most of the policies that are done by administration or the state. When you talk about redistributive, it's more controversial because it talks about reallocation of resources from one group to another. So the resources has to be taken from a specific group of people and then redistribute it to the entire economy to even the amount of resource distribution there is in a particular economy or a particular political context. So its characteristic is transfer of wealth, often contentious. So an example of this is the progressive taxes. So the uneven taxing, progressive taxes means uneven taxing between different group of people. Those people in the higher socioeconomic ladder, those people who gains a lot of income would have also a lot of taxes imposed on them compared to those people in the lower ladder of socioeconomic uh, income or socioeconomic status. Sorry. Another one is the welfare programs. So welfare programs are a broad range of public policies that tries to cater to those people who are impoverished. Usually, it exists on the states with structural adjustment programs where there are uneven how do you say, economic impact of particular policies on specific group of people. Lastly is public housing. So it gives houses to those people who are homeless. Then the third one, according to Lowy, is regulatory policy. So it is defined as controlling or changing behavior through particular rules or laws. So it's an imposition of obligation or restriction to specific group of people. For example, how is the environment regulated through environmental laws, the health and safety regulations, and also consumer protection law. And lastly, the constituent policy. So this one is trying to appeal on the existing structure or existing institution. So its main characteristic is to structure and organize government operations. And for example, it's the taxation, defense policies, environmental regulations to trade policies. So the goal of constituent policy is to build organization from the scratch in order to manage a um, particular, how do you say, in order to manage a particular activity of the state. So yeah. So public policy is also approach through variety of terminologies. So when you talk about policy instruments, so you're talking about laws, services, benefits, contracts, taxes, suasions, or the soft form of persuasions, subsidies, sanction, inspecting, licensing. Whenever you try um, to be credible into something like the food security or building businesses or trying to even riding motorcycles or cars. So you need licenses from the state. So it's also a part of policy instrument, uh, the means through which the state tries to put the individuals into regulations to a set of standards that individuals has to concur into. So the 10th would be informal procedures. It's also some sorts of policy instrument, which is outside the domain of what is to be considered as formalized. So when you're talking about policy domain, so you're talking about health, education, environment, economy, agriculture, ethnic conflict and peace reconciliation. And policy function talks about what would the particular policy um, do? What would it function? Yeah. So it could redistribute, regulate, distribute, constitute. So as part of the typology of public policy I mentioned earlier, but it could also execute, implement, penalize, control, maneuver, incentivize. So whenever you start talking about these things, then you're talking about policy functions. I think it's very important to talk about these terminologies because we tend to ask what is public policy, what is the coverage of public policy, and then we begin giving answers like we're gonna start saying well, public policy is a law, public policy is a means to distribute, to control the resources, or public policy is the means through which we cope with ethnic conflict and peace reconciliation, for instance. So in this regard, we're actually talking about different dimensions of public policy and different uh, means to cope up with the multifaceted nature of what we call as public policy as it is. So I think it's very important to specify these terminologies. So now I'm down with the 7 sets or approaches to public policy. So when you talk about sets or approaches, we talk about how do you say, these things are not entirely separated from each other. When you say stages approach, for example, it could also be referring to institutional, or institutional could be referring to group and network approach, or they could be together all along. But I think it would be fruitful, especially when we're starting from somewhere, to specify particular approaches to public policy, like as it is. So I just want to tell you guys that um, uh, even though it is specified here, in actuality, public policy is more intertwined to each other, despite specifying particular approaches. So, in public policy, we talk about stages approach, institutional approach, group and network approach, exogenous approach, rational actors approach, ideas-based approach, and lastly, synthetic approach. So I will discuss more on 1 to 6, and the 7th one would be, I think, discussed in the tomorrow by some of my colleagues who specializes on particular synthetic approaches in public policy that are widely used by policy analysts and scholars. So the first one is stages approach. So the idea is that policy follows a sequential pattern, which is a set of processes that are connected. So when you say connected, there is a clear start, there is middle and end. It's like a complete storytelling. So there's also the highlight of a linear sequence of loop. So we talk about systemic thinking. When you say systems thinking, there's no particular stages that are unusual or that are bizarre. Things are predictable, and they follow a particular steps. So it could easily be rationalized as you can trace the incremental changes. So when you say stages approach, you also talk about the movement from one stage to another. So there are particular, zooming in into particular stages. So you talk about agenda setting or problem definition, policy formulation, policy adoption, then it can be implemented, and then you start evaluating it and you start gathering feedback from people. So it looks like this. Agenda setting, we have it here. Policy formulation. Agenda setting is like, there's still no policies yet. It's just attention from different actors. And then these are still like ideas where the policymakers would try to gather and try to make into an actual policy and be put into policy formulation stage. Then policy formulation is the actual making of the policy. So we talk about designing of the policy, the substantive or procedural policy designing. Then you move to the decision making. So we're talking about variety of policy proposals, but these are not yet made into an actual policy. So it is up to this particular stage to decide on which policy is more feasible or more substantive than the others. Then you go to the implementation. So you execute the particular policy. And lastly, you evaluate. You try to see whether or not the policy works. And then at the end of the day, it's gonna come back to the agenda setting again, and then you go with policy formulation. So usually the stages cycle goes into loop. If you're familiar in a public administration concept of David Easton, so they also like talk about the black box, and the black box is the decision making body, but the decision making body has to get the input from the people. So they try to get this input from the agenda setting, what particular things come up amongst individuals, what they find as worth of attention for the policymakers to make into an actual policy. And then there's also the last one in the David Easton model. They're talking about the feedback loop. And then it goes into circles all along. And that's how policy is created and how policy is refurnished over and over again. But in actual policy analysis, it might be difficult to particularly pinpoint the stages. That's why this particular approach has been widely criticized as well, because sometimes agenda setting and policy formulation could be like very much intertwined, or there might be existing decision making already, and then what follows next is the agenda setting. Those type of scenarios could come up in the actual policy analysis. So people are like trying to debunk whether or not there really is stages in the actual scenario of looking into public policy. So there's also this in the agenda setting or problem identification stages in public policy. We talk about issue attention cycle. This was formulated by Robert Downes way back 1972. So he talked about why do particular policy gain traction or momentum other than other issue or other policy solutions out there. So according to him, each issue actually follows these particular stages. First, there's this pre-problem. There are existing conditions or situations out there felt by multitude of people. So they have their own concerns. Each actor has their own concerns. But this concern can only be mainstream once something out there gets caught in a public in the swerving public attention out there, and then it moves to the second stage, which is called the alarm discovery and euphoric enthusiasm. So people get to be knowledgeable on the particular situation. For example, like media attention on, let's say, the Olympics. Let's say Olympics. So the catalyst is the media propagation of what has been happening. So there's this alarm discovery and euphoric enthusiasm. People are like into it, and then people would like to, especially policy makers would like to address what the people has been talking about. They want to gather support from people, so they want to respond to what is on trend. However, the third one would be the realization of cause of significant progress. So sometimes, even though they have this problem and then they have this solution, they tend to like die down this euphoric enthusiasm due to the impending cost of the particular policy. Whenever they try to make it into something enactable or something that they can implement, it could be the cost, or it could be like the confounding factors or the variety of interest out there. Like if they would put this policy on table, then it's gonna offend variety of people, but it's also gonna make other people happy. So definitely, whenever the cost is very high, it would gradually decline, and then until it would reach the post-problem stages, where eventually it could come up again through. Okay, I'm gonna address the question later. Thank you so much. And eventually, after post-problem, it would revert back to pre-problem stage until there's a particular catalyst that would make the problem a primary issue in the decision-making table, and it would revert back to alarm discovery or euphoric enthusiasm stage. So that's the basic theory of Robert Downes way back 1972 on the issue attention theory. So this is one of the specific narrowing down of the stages cycle and trying to just look into the agenda setting or problem identification stage in public policy. So it looks like this. This is how the issue would become a public attention until it would gradually decline and would be in a state of stasis, where it could be something that could be picked up and then made into policy again. So another one is the garbage can theory. So the idea is that the policy makers already have a set of solutions for them, and then they would just wait for particular opportune moment to put their solutions into table via trying to weigh in the attention of the people, the enthusiasm of the people. So this is also something that is used to explain why particular. Of course, I would share the presentation slides. This is a particular theory used to explain why new problems are ignored because there is still no particular pet solutions or policy options generated by set of scholars or set of politicians in a particular problem. So this is how it looked like. So we have like, for example, we have a trash can or garbage can for a particular problem. So we have a trash can is the solution. So for organic waste, so you put the organic material in the particular garbage can. The same goes with the paper, plastic, glass, batteries, metal. But how about infectious waste? So this is something that that is not foreseen or something that the politicians doesn't have any solutions. So they try to not dig into it further because it's problematic, it's very contentious, and it's new. It could mean a lot of resources or cost whenever it is implemented into actual policy. So that's why we have this term we call as the wicked problem or the untamed problem, according to Philip Zitton, which I mentioned earlier, who tried to define public policy. He called it the untamed problems because wicked problems are very complex that we try to not dig into it further. And until now, we still haven't provided actual solutions to it, which is problematic and which is a challenge for policy analysts or policy scholars. So the first picture here you can see, that's the poverty, malnutrition, food security. These are still very prominent problems that are still not delved much. So we also have the fossil fuel use, carbon emissions, global warming in the rightmost upper rightmost picture, and then we also have healthcare. So whenever we talk about universal healthcare coverage, how do we really implement this kind of policies? How do we deal with citizenship, non-citizenship, and what is the extent of patient institutionalization, for instance? And lastly, educational reform. If you read Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, so the kind of education that we have is very problematic because it just tries to nourish a working class people, like people that can be used for employment, for productivity. But according to Paulo Freire, this is not the kind of people that we want in the future. We want them to be more critical. But if we're talking about criticality, then it also means a lot of educational reform in the type of curriculum that we're following. So yeah, so it's a very contentious cases. This is not something that is black and white. This is not something that is immediate or something that we can provide coherent solution. So this is this sort of things are something that the garbage can theory can provide an explanation. Whenever there's these policies that doesn't actually sit well with a particular solutions or proposals or policy structures that were already envisioned in the past. So we also have basic theories or concept of policy implementation. So when you talk about implementation, you talk about the philosophical underpinnings of what is to be considered as successful and a failure whenever it is executed. So you try to look at good policy, good executive, or good luck. Good luck is like, what are the factors out there that probably aided the failure or the successes of a particular policy. So when you talk about policy implementation, you might probably encounter these terms, top-down model. So it means the implementation has to originate in an institutional or in the hierarchical system, and then it's supposed to be conducted or uh, implemented by the bureaucracy, and then try to appeal with the institutions. So there's a specific system and also orientation from the top to the bottom to make it more organized, to make it more thorough. But later development is made on this particular model, and now they're trying to talk about the bottom-up model, that we need to hear from the people below. Whenever we try to generate a policy, there should be a people-centric form of analysis whenever we try to formulate or implement a particular public policy. And lastly is the synthetic model. So it's trying to mediate between these two models. So synthetic model, so one way going from the top, one way going from bottom, and try to meet the same ends of trying to make the implementation work in the most effective or most feasible way possible. So synthetic model highlights communication between bureaucracy or the people who implements the policy, and also the informal sectors or the community, formal or informal sectors, and also including the community. So for them, this is the key factor to be considered whenever we try to implement a particular policy. So variety of models were done in order to visualize how the implementation theory scheme operates. So one of these is Van Meter and Van Horn. So there's also the communications model of intergovernmental policy implementations made by Gogin way back 1990. So it tries to put in the feedback mechanism, which is not included in here, how we make the feedback mechanism as a form of intervening variables and an utmost consideration for the improvement of the particular policy. So yeah, so it considers the decision making and also the capacity of the state to implement a particular policy as well. So there's also these concepts and theories on policy evaluation. So when you talk about policy evaluation, so your concern is what is the ends? What is the goal that the policy wants to achieve? So you talk about variety of philosophical concept. So are you talking about effectiveness? So if you're talking about effectiveness or efficiency, then you're gonna appeal more on the economic models, economic measures. So when you're talking about security or safety, then you might as well talk about more authoritarian way of designing, or more control. If you're talking about liberty or freedom of choice, then you're gonna appeal on the people-centric kind of solutions. You try to weigh in their opinions or their ideas on every facet of policy decisions made in a particular context. Adequacy, so you try to weigh in whether or not it is sufficient. Responsiveness, you try to we talk about feedback mechanism in the implementation here. So when you talk about responsiveness, so you try to emphasize more on the effectiveness criterion. Feedback criterion on whatever policy that you're trying to formulate. Appropriateness, you try to appeal on the culture, on the tradition, on the normative practices of the people. Equality, you try to appeal on distributive justice, or equity, justice too. So other concepts of evaluation is sustainability, resiliency, smart via saying the smart city or technologically advanced city, human rights, democracy, virtues or ethics, or of non-corruption, etc. So policy evaluation is much more controversial, I think, among these stages, because at the end of the day, we want to formulate a policy that appeals to our values, and each values varies among different people. So, for example, we talk about equality, equity, and justice. These things, these concepts tend to be right, but they're actually different things. So when you say, I want a policy that evaluates based on equality, your assumption is that everyone benefits from the same support. So you don't talk about the problem, or you don't talk about the deeper structure out there. You don't address it. You just want equal treatment. So it could be still persistent in the future, but at least as of this moment, you acquired equal treatment among different people. But if you talk about equity, you talk about redistributive justice. I talked about the redistributive policy earlier, like progressive taxes. So it fits in this particular evaluative criteria. So your assumption is that everyone gets the support they need. So this is the concept of affirmative action. So that's why we talk about welfare state policies. We try to give more to people who have disproportionate impact on, for example, structural adjustment programs by the state. So we try to make them well off by giving them more than other people. So that's the idea of equity. So justice, this is a much more difficult evaluation criteria. But the idea is that look at these people. The first one, inequality, they just gave similar like how you say, these boxes, no, that they can stand, but one of them still cannot see the game. Then you give them different boxes, and all of them can see the game. But in justice criteria, you remove the barrier, you remove the structure that exists in order for them to see the game. You don't need to give them the boxes anymore because the structure is gone. So this is the idea of justice. You try to appeal into the structural or systemic component. You want to remove this one. So we're talking about patriarchy. We're talking about nepotism or capitalism. If you're a socialist, or people who are like very critical and radical. So you try to dig deep into what people cannot immediately see. So that's the idea of trying to appeal into the justice. Okay, the next one is the institutionalist approach. So earlier we talked about stages approach. The institutionalist approach is more statist. So we focus on the administrative mode of governance. So that's why we appeal more on the bureaucratic system. We try to understand the function and structures of existing institutions, and people who are into comparative study could immediately derive a comparative understanding of different institutions, because it's very how do you say, elaborated. It's very tangible. Each country or each organization always try to specify the kind of institutions that they have. They have this executing body, they have these people who are in charge into something. If you want to delve into institutionalist approach, then you might also try to refer into the role of executive, how they govern the entire institution, what are their treatments to their members. So I emphasize here the idea of elitism. Do they have a clear divide between people who have power, or those versus those people who do not have power? Or the iron triangle, what is the dynamics between, when you say iron triangle, it's talking about the executive body, the bureaucracy, and also the existing interest group. So what are the relationship between these three that forms the iron triangle? So this is your interest in looking at institutions. You also give priority to legal status or the existing regulations. So you have emphasized on what is considered as legal, what is considered as formalized or legitimized. So you have to follow these laws. Your scope of analysis is into following these laws. So before, the focus on institutionalist approach was only on the state, but recent development are talking about um, the new institutionalism. So from the state, you're gonna talk about the economic perspective or the rational choice theory, the cultural perspective, the historical perspective, or the discursive perspective. They call it the first, second, third, and fourth new institutionalism. So, so for example, if you wanna understand the function and the structure of different institution, then you can look at it in this way. So we have this UK structure of governance, South Korea too, Estonia, Singapore, and you try to derive a coherent understanding out of trying to understand the limitation and the advantages of these different institutional structures. And the pioneering, at least in my class in public policy, the pioneering theories on institutional approaches, the Elinor Ostrom, who talk about the institutional analysis and development framework. She's also one of the female receiver of the Nobel Prize for her framework. So she's talking about how institutions forms due to the need to govern the commons. So her understanding was derived from the classic The Tragedy of the Commons. If you want to read on it further, then you can also try to dig into it. Recent development on Ostrom's work talks about a more critical perspective, trying to refer to the discourse, the role of the discourse, and also the unspoken rules or non-normative conditions that try to form the kind of institutions that we have today. So this is by the work of Whaley, and he also tried to integrate the institutionalist framework with the critical realist concept of emergence. I think this is very technical. So I just included here because some of you might be interested in looking at institutionalist framework. Then this is something that you should definitely try to look at. Okay. The next approach is on groups or networks approach. So the idea is that they try to recognize that approaching particular policy issue or problem is not easy because these problems tend to be very dynamic. It means it changes over time. Like it could be a problem now, but it might not be a problem in the future. Or it could be highly interdimensional. But what I mean by interdimensional is that different approaches or different it tries to be intertwined with, for example, different approaches in public policy or different domains of public policy. So we talk about problem on agriculture, but also problem in economy, but also problem on food security, something like that. So it's very, very difficult to just constrain the network on, for example, the government alone or the institutions alone that is under the scope of the state. But we need to rather see it in variety of interest group, and we try to also narrow down the particular role or influences that they play in the public policy arena. So in here, we talk about the interest group and also the pressure group. So we have this interest group, people who have direct power to influence the legislative outcomes. And we also have the pressure group. They may not be immediately involved in the decision making, but they have the capacity to to um, to put pressure to the people in power. Usually, these people have the capacity to mobilize the masses, to mobilize the people, to act in a particular way. So it pressures the interest group and the policymakers to make a particular policy. So so when you say group or networks, so policy is like um, something that everyone wants to have. So every people who has their own interest, they want to have their own policy derived from their particular interest. So this is the state of equilibrium. So this is what they want to achieve. So group or networks approach gained momentum in the age of corporatism. So it means um, we're talking about the capitalism and the neo liberalist economy, where there's a particular role that the corporate or the business sector plays in the policy making. So they are also called the peak associations. They have immediate, how do you say, immediate impact in the policy making process and the decision making procedures. So, policy is something that they they want to influence, and they also have their own pet solutions or proposals that are readily forwarded to the people in power in order to influence it and to abide with their own self-invested um, goals or objectives. It is also something that gained momentum in the age of pluralism. So we're talking about a variety of actors, variety of ideologies, where there is highlighting of the role of different actors in policy subsystems. So policy subsystem means people who are immediately concerned with the policy making procedures. So they're involved in it. They have the power. Uh, they have the power to decide the particular policy options and to select the available policies. So policy subsystem also talks about the policy networks, group of people who would want to corroborate and also compromise their own interest in order to develop their own policy. So they try to negotiate with other people. So this is something that the group or network approach is very much interested upon. So when you talk about group or network, there are two main classifications. So you're talking about whether or not this group or network have loose or dense relation. So if you're talking about loose relation, like the members could come and go, they don't have they don't have core ideology or belief that binds them together. So you're talking about issue network. So this is more temporary rather than how you say permanent or something that lasts for a uh, long term affairs. Meanwhile, in contrast to that, we have policy community. This is more denser. People who have more similar ideologies or similar core belief would be classified as people who are in a policy community networks. So to give you a more coherent how do you say classification of what policy community and issue network is, Marsh and Rhodes way back 1992, they specified what are the typologies of network. So whenever you're talking about relatively small people trying to get into to get trying to group themselves, and also they also strategically exclude people from getting into their circle. So we're talking about the policy community here. In contrast, issue network is much more larger, more exclusive, and it's also open to a range of actors or members. Um, they have enormous slots for people who wants to come in. Policy community is more stable. The issue network is not. there's always contestation. Then policy community is more, how you say, interactive. They want to have high quality interaction and frequent interaction. They have membership criteria. No, they're more exclusive. But whenever you talk about issue network, the contacts or the interaction may fluctuate over time. They might have different um, values that impedes them from actually collaborating genuinely and having high quality interaction. Uh, in issue network, there's also like persistent conflict among their members, which is different from policy community because most of the time they have um, basic values. They share basic values and also are willing to accept legitimacy of the outcome. So, for example, I cannot say specific in Myanmar, but in the Philippines we have how do you say, party politics. Uh, I think I would classify it more as a form of issue network because there's political butterfly whenever a particular political party, which is comprised of variety of people, um, whenever uh, it's burned in a particular controversy, people would just flee from this party and just form another one, abandon the kind of network that they have, the party system. Where is very different from, for example, the Democrats and Republicans in the U.S., where they have more, how to say, rigid membership and more exclusive, more, how do you say, more coherent or more group thinking. They share more basic values, which is um, which is something that binds the community together. So the kind of policy that they make is more in line with the value of the community. But in the issue network, it's more chaotic. It's more unpredictable because variety of ideas, variety of ideologies exist among the different members who tries to influence the kind of policies that they forward as a network. So maybe let's take a brief um, break for 10 minutes and then I'm going to start it again. And now we're going to talk about exogenous approach. Thank you so much. See you in 10 minutes. Hello. Okay, I'm gonna continue the second half of the discussion. Thank you so much, everyone, for hanging in there and then getting getting past through um the first part and still being here with me. So yeah, okay. So the next part is on exogenous approach. So whenever we talk about exogenous approach, we talk about the external factors. We talk about outside the public policy environment, but has an immense amount of, um, outside the public policy context, or a particular environment where the public policy can be enacted from. For example, we're talking about a particular locality or a particular nationality, uh, which uh, which still has a very potent power to influence the kind of public policy in this um, um, particular arena, like in a national or local setting. So when you talk about exogenous approach, you're looking at politics, society, and economy at large. You're um, transmigrating from national or local boundaries or whatever the existing boundary exists uh, in a particular system. So you emphasize it and make it the center of your analysis. You put it into a rigid scrutiny or criticism. So so for example, you're talking about macroeconomy. You're trying to look at the influence of markets, global markets, uh, uh, universal politics, or global politics. Um, for example, For example, when you're interested with the oil crisis, uh, in the context of Myanmar, for example. So you're not just talking about the Myanmar context as it is. You're talking about um, the source of the oil, for example, the fossil fuel. For example, you will be concerned with how things are going um, with the Russia and Ukraine crisis, because Ukraine is a huge global source of oil, or the Israeli and the Iran conflict, something like that. So your key focus is on international or global regime. Uh, Usually it tries to integrate comparative analysis as well. So you're trying to see the global and north divide, global north and south divide, how um, how the dynamics of the relationship goes. The notion of climate justice is very much prominent these days. If you're gonna look at the global north and south relationship, if you're familiar with the flying geese model, something that um, a Japanese political economist has seen, or you're trying to look at into the dependency theory. So this is something that would interest you so much. It is also a form of exogenous approach in public policy. So you also have interest probably on the hegemonic states, the role of the political and economic hegemony in the world, the US and the China. And you would be appealing with the broad philosophical underpinnings of the globalization, westernization, easternization, etc., and whatnot, or neoliberalism, or and the critique to capitalism or consumerism. So this is something that you can approach in this particular paradigm of public policy. So this here is the Sustainable Development Goals, probably very much familiar with you. Um, it may not be um, it may not be all negative. You may also try to understand what are the impact of the universal criterion for a good public policy or governance systems imposed by external institutions that tries to influence the kind of policy systems in local and national settings. So in here, for example, in this Sustainable Development Goals, these are not immediately derived from particular national or domestic context, but they also have a um, potent influence on the policymaking made in that particular context. So, this is one way of seeing the exogenous approach whenever this SDG is implemented. And for example, we also have this one, uh, the shift to the Internet of Things, uh, what are to be considered as smart city. So the world is like the kind of public policy and governance is also trying to abide with the global trend. What are the existing approaches there is in the entire world? And then if you want to see particular uh, domain of particular policy out there, broader scheme of policy, and how it is applied to the particular setting, then exogenous approach is the right approach for you in public policy. um, the next one is the rational choice approach. Probably this is very familiar, especially with the INI economics. Rational choice is a paradigm in public policy that tries to integrate very well the economic theories and also um, the the principles of how policy actors and individuals behave into the actual policy making systems. So rational choice approach is focusing on the policy actors and citizens at the individual level. So the focus is on trying to influence the behavior of individuals um, via the creation of particular policy. It also highlights the reason with the assumption that they are the rational agent, Homo economicus, or the economic man. So whenever you try to deal with public policy concept in this particular approach, you would appeal to broader economic models or statistical calculations to measure the costs and benefits for the specific decision um, and derive an evaluation based on this criteria of assessment. The goal is to always maximize the gain by trading off and comparing choices and minimize any possible um, input or the cost of acquiring this gain. So you also want to understand in public policy domain the legislative process via looking at the self-invested account of politicians. People are always focused on whatever makes them more self-serving. Um, yeah. The decision, all of their decision is derived from their interest. And whenever you approach collective actions in public policy, you're looking at incentives or sanctions, incentives, or for example, what would make them comply. And this policy of complying would form a collective decision or sanction. Sanction is more on the penalty or punishment of not behaving in a particular way. So collective action is derived from the individual choices via incentive and sanctions. And you delve on the issue of free rider or the opportunism. This is one thing that the rational choice approach would be very much invested in. So rational choice approach is also differentiated into particular domains. So for example, if you're talking about solely the rational public choice theory, so your focus is on policy decisions being analogous or similar to market decisions, where individuals or groups would want to achieve the highest gain at the lowest cost. So this is the goal of any decision makers out there or politicians out there. This is what they want to achieve. So policymakers are seen as rational actors via means of like always seeing the marginal utility or what is the highest advantage out of deciding in a particular policy. Um, who would weigh cost and benefits to maximize utility. So they're always thinking, what can they get out of this particular policy, and they don't care whether or not what it would uh, what it would result in the broader scheme of things. Or maybe they would, but at the end of the day, it would still boil down on their interest. If it benefits them in the long run, then they might still like go with the least conventional choice. Another one is on game theory. So whenever you talk about game theory, you're talking about the strategies amongst the interaction among various players. So you're not just talking about the theory per se, you're talking about the manifestation of the theory in the policy decisions. So the outcomes would depend on action of all participants. So it's like playing a game of chess like this one. So policies are crafted based on the anticipation of others' action. So they would try to understand or they would try to catch up the particular actions that their opponents would do and then create the possible strategic maneuver in order to serve their own interest or objective. So it could either be win lose lose lose. This is the lose lose is not something that they would want, or win win strategy. This is the most optimal desire of the politicians. So that's why they form collaborations, they form advocacy coalitions, they form networks. They aim to acquire this win-win outcome whenever they try to make a particular policy decision. Because policy decisions are always sometimes, no, sorry, I won't say always, oftentimes very contested. A lot of values are being talked through. So so policies with varieties of values would try to reach a particular consensus where they would acquire maximum impact or maximum outcome out of this particular policy scenario. So another one is on welfare economics. So a focus on the disproportionate population, but a focus on welfare economics also entails that policies should be designed to maximize social welfare. So services among the people, we're talking about education, healthcare, social security programs. So we ensure the greatest good for the greatest number. So it's the usual utilitarian precepts, greatest good for the greatest number. So policymakers, in order to achieve this, would use varieties of model like cost-benefit analysis. They also use cost-effectiveness analysis to evaluate different policy options and would tend to choose the one that would provide them the highest net social gain. So net social gain, it means the collective social gain among a particular context. Lastly is behavioral economics. Variety of public policy scholars would delve into behavioral economics. It's gaining variety of momentums as of this moment. So when you say behavioral economics, you're talking about how policies can be developed to influence individual behavior in ways that leads to desirable social outcomes without coercion, without incentive or punishment. So earlier I talked about punishment and incentive, but that's actually how do you say that's actually one of the traditional public policy approach in economics perspective. These days they're trying to revert to behavioral economics. So in this way, they try to use public policy tools they call the nudging to influence behaviors subtly. So what do I mean by this? Whenever they say incentive and punishment, they also say the carrot and the stick policies. So carrot, you try to feed the donkey with a carrot, and then the donkey would walk, would try to eat the carrot that you put forward. So that's how you influence the behavior of the donkey. But if you say punishment, so sometimes stick. Sorry, sometimes um you would hit the donkey in the butt, and then you would still acquire the same outcome. You can make them move forward. So that's the carrot and stick. But some people would say that, how about we talk to the donkey? Um, we try um, to appeal to the natural behavior of the donkey without trying to force them in the most direct way. So that's the idea of the nudges. For example, this one, they still sell cigarette, but they put something in their pockets. So they show this horrible image of a baby, and then they also like put information in here, like saying cigarettes cause leukemia. They poison in every puff. So even though they still sell this cigarette, which is also because if they would stop the production of the cigarette, the tendency is that it may hurt economy. There's a reverberating impact to the people who works in the cigarette factory. So um, it's gonna hurt the economy in the long run. So they cannot do it immediately. So they must do it gradually. So they want to disincentivize the cigarette use through policy nudging, through doing something like this. Uh, they put warning in the hope of like demotivating people from taking up cigarette smokes. Another one is this one. So they put art uh, to influence the behavior of the individuals. So see here, they put like motivational quotes to encourage exercise and reduction of the calorie intake. No, so they put here, I want to climb the stairs to fitness. So in the hope of like encouraging people to use the stairs rather than use the elevator in the rightmost part of the picture. So this is not immediately punishing them. You're giving them options, but you want them to behave in a particular way that you want indirectly. So the nudge theory has been sustained by various uh, uh, scholars like Thaler and Fontaine. So they say by knowing how people think, we can use sensible choice architecture to nudge people towards the best decision for ourselves, our families, and our society without restricting our freedom of choice. Sometimes it also appeals to the cultural values of the people. For example, um, I don't know if it's real, but one of my adjunts, professor in public policy, she said that in Thailand they use nudge in a way through which they put like an how do you say altar, like a small house, which is something that the uh, Buddhism belief religion would would put into houses, but this time they would put it into the places where usually people would pee, would urinate. So they put it there, and then the people wouldn't pee in there anymore because they feel like it's gonna disrespect the altar, the the Buddhist religion. So yeah, that's one way of communicating the desire of the policymaker with their constituents without directly enforcing it. So in public policy, the nudge means policy mechanisms and communications that are designed to discreetly encourage people to modify their behavior without forcing. So no forcing. So it's very different from the regulations, sanctions, and orders, and it's more psychological. but also something that appeals to the rational choice. So because it tries um, to appeal into the rationality of individuals. So in the use of nudge, even people have a freedom of choice. Those choices are framed from the beginning. So policymaker would design the particular policy that they want in accordance to the choice of the people. So in this regard, they call it the choice architect rather than the enforcers of something. So they find it very revolutionary and very effective, especially in the contemporary time where we find it very difficult to control people's behaviors. So it's a more cultural approach to public policy, but also via choice because economic approach is also interested with the individual choices. So it's also something that connects back to the economic approach or rational choice approach. So the sixth one is the ideas-based approaches. Yeah, by ideas-based approaches, we're talking about the role of ideas, beliefs, and knowledge in shaping policy decisions and outcomes. So, so you talk about why do people behave in a particular way, but you're not talking about the rational choices, but you're talking about the cultural or the structural or the discursive components there is that tries to guide the people to behave in a particular way or that guides a particular policy to become an actual policy. So, or the implementation process. It depends on the narrow down of the scope of the ideas-based approach. So, in as a whole, so the approach highlight how ideational factors influence the formulation, implementation, and also evolution of public policy. In this regard, we talk about policy learning, transfer, and diffusion. So how ideas are built uh, and how ideas are and um, reproduced and also integrated into various contexts, various setting. So ideas-based approaches have um, variety of approaches actually, but in this regard, I'm just gonna talk about two of the most prominent ones. So we're talking about post-positivist perspective and sorry, interpretivist perspective in public policy. So when we talk about post-positivist perspectives, the idea is that we try to, yeah, I'm talking about ideas now because this is ideas approach. We try to go outside the domain of of positivism. So when we say positivism, like everything is definite, everything is calculable. There's a particular process or stages. So it's very certain. The scholars in the past have said that actually we cannot be certain on particular issue. It's not very easy to derive a policy solution to a particular issue because our ideas about the particular issue is very different, uh, different and also very varied. And each individual who would try to look at the issue have different way of defining the issue in the first place. So for post-positivist people, they would say um, rather than looking at the issue in the positivist way, in a calculable way or measurable way, why not we talk about the culture or the ideas behind a particular policy? For example, uh, global warming. The scientists would say we are in a global warming scenario right now because the Earth's population reached this particular degree Fahrenheit or Celsius. So that's their definition of global warming. But if you start talking to the people or the farmers or the people on ground, they wouldn't understand global warming. They would understand, if you're gonna talk to fishermen, they would understand that the sea level is rising, and they cannot um they cannot go to the beach as they cannot do fishing as easier as before, or their house is getting swallowed by the ocean. Or if you're gonna talk about agriculture people or the farmers, they would say that you cannot say that it's global warming because the Earth has reached this particular magnitude, Celsius or Fahrenheit. They understand global warming via different seasonal patterns. Planting of the trees before was made on July, but now we're making it on October, and it's destroying how we're doing things before. So it differs from different people. So that's the idea of post-positivist perspective. If we're trying to always talk about measurable, we're just trying to appeal on people who have the knowledge, who are scholars, and who has the ability to identify the problem via their own measurements. But it doesn't actually reflect on the understanding of the normal or regular people. So that's the idea of post-positivist perspective. So even though there's this broad idea on post-positivism, it's still categorized into variety of domains. If you're gonna focus on critical policy analysis, so the idea of sorry, this is a little bit more difficult because it's post-positivism, one of the, I think, most difficult part in policy analysis. I've been doing it recently, so bear with me. And also, I encourage everyone to ask questions if you have some. So the critical idea in the critical policy analysis is going beyond what is immediately perceivable, what we are used to in our traditional policy analysis whenever we do cost-benefit analysis, and try to address the deeper and often hidden power dynamics, the existing ideologies and social injustice embedded in policies, and also their formulation processes. So, in public policy, we use tools like the causal layered analysis. We're trying to look at different domain of understanding, and we try to deconstruct the assumption on particular policy issue via the ideas of class, ideas, because this is still part of the ideas-based approaches, ideas of class, the power, ideology, the notion of equity, social justice, etc., and whatnot. One facet of it is more focused on the criticism on the technocratic approach. Technocratic, it means the positivism, the utmost reliance to quantifiable measures and economic models. So usually whenever we try to look at it in numbers, we usually ignore people's voices or ideas or experiences. Thus, in order to create a better or sustainable policy, we should concern ourselves on the democratic means of acquiring a particular policy by supporting deliberative forums that pave the way towards meaningful participation. So in this way, we try to make a policy that focus on the procedural component in policy designing. By means of procedural component, it means we try to look at the processes of making public policy in the first place. So if you're an advocate for deliberative policy analysis, you would provide variety of means to incorporate people's ideas in the policymaking. So you have to orchestrate town hall meetings, deliberative polling, citizen jury, consensus conference, planning cells, and online platforms. So the goal is not to increase participation, rather to increase the quality of the participation. So you want to have an inclusive, an authentic, and a deliberative space for the people to weigh their ideas or experiences, and then out of that generate a meaningful public policy that would cater to the particular context that a locale needs. In interpretivist perspective, it's more focused on the procedures of analysis for us as scholars, or for you guys if you want to analyze public policy based on post-positivist perspective. So the policy discourse analysis is relying on the assumption that policy and its impact are socially and politically constructed. So by politically constructed, you're saying that there's no ideas out there that creates meaning for itself. We put meaning into it, and it is differently perceived by people depending on their own definition given to it. So, for example, like a spoon. A spoon may just be a spoon for me, but for blacksmith, they may see the spoon as a silver or as a platinum, or the material component of it. Or for people who have a memorable experience with a spoon, or like, for example, somebody gifted me a spoon. So the spoon may mean differently for me. It may mean like a gift from a beloved friend, and this spoon reminds me of this friend. So so the spoon is just a social and political construction that we make out of it. So the same goes with the particular definition we give to a particular issue and the policy solution that we derive from analysis of this particular issue. So rather than looking at it as an objective way, we're appealing to the meaning mechanism, how different people perceives the construction of the spoon or the construction of the policy. So there are different measures that they employ. If you're gonna talk about the textual or the interpretation, so you might be interested with the hermeneutics. If you're talking about how it is delivered, you're gonna talk about rhetoric, talking about the how a particular issue is defined in terms of who is being victimized and who is being penalized, then you're gonna look at the narrative component of discourse. Or if you're gonna look about the experiences of the people, how they form ideas of problem definition or issue identification. So you're gonna appeal on phenomenology in form of discourses. So these approaches would focus on understanding the meanings, interpretation, and subjective experiences of individuals or group of people. So lastly, synthetic approaches. So when we talk about synthetic approaches, it's more, how do you say, varied. So you have a particular approach or framework or model, but this model is citing, for instance, like the policy network approach, and then also the stages approach, and also trying to cite on the group approach. So it tries to combine different elements or approaches in public policy. So as a whole, it refers to a method that combines elements from multiple theoretical frameworks and analytical approaches to provide a more comprehensive and nuanced understanding of policy issues. So, for example, we have policy advocacy coalition framework. So the idea is that policy is a result of the interaction among advocacy coalitions within a policy subsystem. So, so this one is combining the approach on policy network via the postulation of each coalition being a network of members, and also ideas approach via saying that these people share the policy core beliefs. I'm not gonna talk more about policy advocacy coalition because I think some of my peers is gonna allocate a significant portion of time trying to delve into this theories. So policy is changed when but the idea is policy is changed when one strong coalition exploits a weak coalition, or when competing coalition negotiate agreements. So they try to compromise the core beliefs that they have. So sometimes policy change can spend more than 10 years, or depending on the rigidity of each network of members. So this is the entire theory of policy coalitions, advocacy coalition by Sabatier, I think. And the next one is multiple streams framework. This is also my dissertation topic, but I'm not gonna delve on it. I think some of my peers is also gonna talk about it. So the idea is not the ought to or the should be theory, but rather to explain what actually happens. It's very important. This is actually an agenda setting framework of analysis, but turns out it's also a synthetic approach because it tries to integrate different approaches in public policy via talking about stages, ideas, and trying to look into institutional approaches. So the idea is that there's a policy entrepreneur who tries to couple the existing problem definition, the political environment, and also the policy ideas that exist in a particular context or policy situation. So this is called the coupling whenever these streams, the problem politics and policy streams, finally conjoin together. So this opportune moment is called the coupling, which is ripe for a particular policy to be finally made into to an actual implementable kind of regulation. So lastly is punctuated equilibrium theory. I'm not sure if this is going to be discussed, but it's a theoretical framework in public policy. I think the earliest one was derived from the movement of trends on budget allocations in the US way back. I'm not sure, maybe 2005, but I remember it's early 2000. So that's how the punctuated equilibrium theory originated. So it explains the pattern of policy change characterized by long periods of stability or the equilibrium interrupted by short, intense bursts of significant change. So in a simple terms, when we say policy change, it's not actually something that happens right away. So it happens via gradual changes, via, how do you say, pressure, tension among the dynamics of the actors, and then suddenly it erupts, and then there's a policy change. So we're talking about negative and positive feedback here. Negative feedback, it means dampening the policy change, trying to stop possible changes. And this is what institutions do. This is what the bureaucracy tries to do. They try to stop any disruption because it's gonna explode. It's gonna need a lot of resources. It's gonna need changes. And people doesn't want changes, especially those people who are in power. They want to preserve their power if we're gonna go back to the rational choice approaches. And then positive feedback is the kind of mechanism that are done by policy actors in order to catalyze immediate change. So they want to mobilize the people, they want to change the narrative of the people in order to allow particular punctuation, also in accordance to their favor. Functional equilibrium theory also talks about disproportionate information processing. So when you say disproportionate information processing, it means that the decision making cannot give attention to all issues, all problems there is. They can only give attention to specific ones that appeals to them. And those issues or those problems that are left behind, it leads to institutional friction that gradually explodes and punctuates. Like they cannot hold this issue because this issue is gonna evolve into more difficult to control ones because it's gonna be left behind. And this is gonna cause a lot of punctuation or structural changes in the future, or policy shifts, policy attention shifts. So the idea of punctuated equilibrium theory was formulated by Baumgartner, I think, if you're familiar with it, if you're interested with it. So it's also a mixture of variety of approaches, like institutional approaches in public policy, policy network approaches, and ideas approaches, particularly the rational choice approach. So this theory, I think multiple streams framework and advocacy coalition framework is going to be discussed further by my colleagues, Tunmin O, and also one of my senior. So I urge everyone to attend the succeeding sessions for an in-depth discussion with selected synthetic approaches in public policy. And I think we're down now to the questions and answer portion. So if you have any questions you want to ask, please feel free to.
Why most of the ASEAN countries are very stuck in the policy making? What is the main problem of the ASEAN country, and why some ASEAN countries are successful in the policy making? What are the difference between them?
What? Sorry. Can you repeat your question? What are?
Why the policy making barriers are happening in the most of the ASEAN countries, and why some of the countries are successful? What is the main difference between successful and unsuccessful between the policy making process in the different ASEAN countries?
That's very